Module 3, Relational Summary Lecture GSP1, Solar Cities. It isn't that there weren't powerful political players in the South who didn't see a tantalizing path toward a solar future. Israel made aggressive strides towards solar from the 70s on, such that today over 85% of homes and buildings have solar hot water, and even massive office buildings in Tel Aviv were built decades ago with sloped south-facing roofs to accommodate PV panels, while desert regions near the Red Sea were covered with solar panels from Arava Light and Power. They moved that way early on because of a need for energy security in the face of disruptions due to regional political conflict. But the rest of the region was never given such permission, as George Clooney's character observes in the political thriller Syriana, when the crown prince of one of the rich Gulf countries is taken out by a CIA missile shortly after announcing that his country would get off of oil and lead a solar revolution in the Middle East. These aren't wholly works of fiction. All you have to do is compare the ecological and political maps of the world, the implications of all the cities that have abundant sunshine becoming solar cities is a game over deal. A game over deal not just for climate change, but also for the fossil fuel powers that fueled it. The geopolitical implications are staggering given the staggering amount of solar energy available, not just in direct electromagnetic rays of sunshine. We're talking about up to 173,000 terawatts a day, 10 times the entire global demand for energy. But all its derivatives, from wind to water to biomass and garbage-derived biogas. This module explores why all that pollution-free energy is gone and continues to go to waste, and why the politics of the sunlight-saturated global south holds the key to reversing global warming. Australia was one of the leaders of the Solar Cities movement back in 2007, just a year after I registered my own NGO called Solar Cities in Egypt. Wikipedia states, Solar Cities is an innovative $97 million demonstration program designed to promote solar power, smart meters, energy conservation, and new approaches to electricity pricing to provide a sustainable energy future in urban locations throughout Australia. There's also a Solar Cities initiative in Europe that mayors are asked to sign up for. All of these act as demonstration projects and incentives to make our cities independent of fossil fuels. In my case, my not-for-profit Solar Cities started when I was living in Cairo, Egypt as a PhD student in urban planning. I was building solar hot water systems and biodigesters with the urban poor on a USAID small infrastructure grant. The goal was to educate people in the slums to the possibility of using the abundant sunshine that Egypt is blessed with to make their polluted, congested part of the city better. And once we realized how easy it really was to build our own solar thermal systems and biogas systems and to install photovoltaic and small urban wind generators, we thought, wow, every city can and should be a solar city. This isn't rocket science. So my friends from the Coptic Christian Zabaleen trash recycling community and my friends from the old Islamic craftsman community formed the NGO Solar Cities. The name we chose was a translation of the Arabic Mudan Shams, which itself was the plural form of a translation from the Greek Heliopolis, or City of the Sun, which was the part of Cairo I had first lived in before I moved into the slums, named by the Greeks for the ancient part of Egypt where the pharaohs worshipped the sun god Ra. It seemed appropriate because we could reference the legendary Heliopolis. Helios means sun and polis means city, and entreat people to join the movement to power our cities by sunshine once again, particularly in the south where cities are bathed in sun. The problem has been that the urban phenomenon as we now know it has a decidedly northern bias. Ever since the rise of industrial giants like large London, with what Blake called its dark satanic mills, bleak, gray, smoke-filled, rat-infested cities congested with cold, crowded tenements run by Dickensian slumlords, there's been an almost implicit assumption that this is what all cities must look like. The explicit and implicit northeastern bias has infected policy all over the world, and I've watched it over my lifetime. When I was in high school, I wrote 2 research papers that changed my view of the world. The first was called Poseidon's Last Stand, submitted to my biology teacher in 1978 after I started taking scuba diving trips from New York to the Caribbean. I noticed that the waters and the reefs I loved so much were increasingly being polluted. In Bermuda, where I was diving on shipwrecks, after the dive on the beach, my feet were always getting covered in tar from the oil spills we'd been reading about in the newspapers that had traveled for miles and miles and washed ashore in these otherwise idyllic places. It was a mess to clean up, and I had to ask myself, why are we shipping oil all over the planet? And how can it ever be done safely given how often ships wreck? We were diving on shipwrecks after all. Later, exploring alternatives to oil right after the 3 Mile Island meltdown in 1979 when I was a junior, I wrote a research paper called Atom in Eden, in which I studied the work of President Carter's energy advisor, Amory Lovins, whom 31 years later I had the pleasure of being on a panel with at the Aspen Energy Forum. He had concluded then, and explained to me over lunch all those decades later, that the nuclear option was a deadly red herring, promoted for political rather than economic or environmental reasons. This was particularly true for countries bathed in sunlight, like Iran and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, who had begun an aggressive nuclear energy program around the time of our Energy Forum. Dr. Lovins told me that based on the experience with India and Pakistan, where each country claimed it was only pursuing nuclear power for peaceful electrical purposes, and then violated the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and promptly built bombs, and based on catastrophic meltdowns that have plagued the US, Russia, and Japan, to say nothing of the potential for terrorists to build dirty bombs from pilfered nuclear waste, there is no way to make atomic power a safe alternative to fossil fuels. And when you find respected scientists like the otherwise laudable Gaia theory originator James Lovelock championing nuclear power as a way out of climate change, you have to read the assumptions his model is based on and ask yourself if you agree with them. For example, Lovelock is quite clear in stating that he prefers nuclear energy to other climate solutions because he believes that although radiation causes cancer and mutations, an increased mutation rate can actually lead to faster evolution. And he believes that the more possibilities there are, the more mutant phenotypes for natural selection to work on, the quicker Gaia can weed out maladapted phenotypes and establish a new normal. Keeping anthropogenic carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere apparently is too much for Gaia to regulate, and he doesn't seem to think governments should be regulating anything. Certainly not economic growth. So massive atomic power plants are the way to go for him. To me, of course, the bald-faced eugenics of this solution are completely disturbing. Lovelock's argument, coming from a wealthy, extremely well-educated and successful white British male, smacks of privilege, as all arguments for a Darwinian solution do. They're great if you're able to adapt, but it sucks if you're one of the losers in the genetic lottery. And it smacks of what I call the Northeast blinkered bias, meaning that policies recommended by or made by political actors in the Northeast are constrained by their experience and fail to take into account the climatic realities of other regions. Prominent figures in London, New York, Tokyo, Seoul, or Chicago, the centers of the stock exchanges that rule the planet's finances, determine that a given energy solution isn't feasible for foggy London town or cloudy, crowded, skyscraper-ridden New York, and conclude therefore that it won't work for anybody else. I remember this as a high school student writing those papers after returning to New York from the sunny Caribbean and the sunshine state of Florida. President Jimmy Carter had responded to the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident and the Iranian oil embargo by putting solar hot water panels on the White House. The articles I read, and my high school teachers, were absolutely certain that this was a futile and economically unfeasible political stunt because solar energy could never supply all our energy needs, given how few sunny days there were and how hard it supposedly was to store solar energy overnight, to say nothing of storing heat during the cold, dark winters. It took a quarter century for me to learn how wrong they were in a hands-on way when I started building my very own solar hot water systems on my roof and my neighbors' roofs in the crowded slums of old Islamic Cairo. Even one of my revered professors at the American University of Cairo had discouraged me from trying to take our experiments in do-it-yourself solar, which we had been researching on the roof of the science building, to the mainstream. He'd been quoted in the newspapers and magazines as saying, "Solar is a wonderful solution, but doesn't have much of a future in our cities because it needs a large surface area to capture useful amounts of sunlight, and the cities are filled with tall buildings, filled with people. There simply isn't enough roof space in a building to capture enough energy for all the residents living below. Well, so much for solar cities, right? The only problem with the argument is that it was once again biased by the living conditions and constraints of the people making the argument. When I actually started doing household surveys on the microeconomics of hot water demand among the poor communities of Old Cairo and the shanty town of the trash recyclers, I found that most buildings were no more than 3 or 4 stories tall. Sure, a few solar hot water panels and photovoltaic panels on a skyscraper isn't going to serve scores of families, but there are literally hundreds of millions of families living in cities who do have enough roof space. And to say we shouldn't pursue a solar city policy because direct solar doesn't work for people in midtown Cairo, much less midtown Manhattan, is callous. And to let them suffer and die because they can't afford reliable electricity or gas again smacks of eugenics. I want to remind you that the political South is actually quite different from the ecological South. In fact, the political South can better be referred to as the solar North. A look at the map reveals that the vast majority of big cities in what we call the South are actually in the Northern Hemisphere. Cairo, Lagos, Mexico City, Puerto Rico, Guatemala City, Bogota, Colombia, all the cities of the Middle East and India, China, Vietnam, even Singapore, these are all in the north, and all could become solar cities. The largest metropolitan areas in the Southern Hemisphere are Jakarta, 32 million people, Sao Paulo, 22 million, Buenos Aires, Kinshasa, 16 million each, Rio de Janeiro, 12 million, Johannesburg, 11 million, Lima, 10 million, Santiago, 7 million, Sydney and Melbourne, 5 million each. And every one of them could be a solar city. The Australian cities are already on target, as we mentioned. But the cloudy north, the far north, has trumped the solar north and impeded its development for centuries. The reason was clearly illustrated by a cartoon that was published when Reagan removed Carter's solar panels from the White House. It read, "You want coal? We own the mines. You want oil and gas? We own the wells. You want nuclear energy? We own the uranium. You want solar power? We own the... solar power isn't feasible." I can't tell you the number of arguments I had about the feasibility of solar power during that era when I was in high school and in college. People would, for example, cite articles saying that in order to keep solar hot water warm overnight, you needed to have a basement filled with large, expensive, concentrated brine salt tanks that could hold the heat overnight. Otherwise, you had to take all of your warm showers at the end of the day, just after the sunset. No hot showers in the morning when you were getting ready to go to work. And most of us weren't willing to sacrifice that luxury. That myth, and it was a myth, deterred me from investing in solar hot water until I moved into the slums of Cairo, where the electricity was always being cut and getting gas bottles was a burden. I built my first solar hot water system in 2005 and experienced that morning cold water problem until I was sitting one winter morning drinking hot tea from a thermos that had been prepared the night before. I thought to myself, if the thermos can keep the tea hot overnight, why can't I simply insulate the hot water tank on my roof? It turned out that with strips of 2-inch styrofoam spray foamed onto the outside of the tank, I was able to keep the water warm for a good 16 hours or so. A shower at 8 p.m. would be at scalding 50 degrees Celsius, and in the morning it would be around 40 degrees Celsius, still plenty hot. And that was using a makeshift solution from cheap styrofoam. Obviously, a more expensive tank with a vacuum layer, like a thermos bottle, would hardly lose any heat at all. So where did the misinformation come from? I also learned that I could power almost everything I needed, lights, fans, computer, radio, microwave, with 2 simple 100-watt PV panels and 2 100-amp-hour deep cycle batteries with a 30-amp charge controller and a 1,000-watt inverter. Back when I was in graduate school and put this system on my roof of my apartment in the year 2000 in LA, I called it the $1,500 solution. Today, the same setup, which takes an hour to get running, costs only about $500. Refrigerators and air conditioners take a larger setup, of course, but for basic needs, the $500 solution works fine, particularly if you're in the southern parts of the solar north. And then there's the home biogas solution, which for about $600 can transform your family's food waste and toilet waste and other organic waste into an hour or 2 of cooking a day. Again, the experience of northerners upset that they can't do their biogas cooking in their frigid winters if they keep their digesters outside has biased everybody else against this elegant solution. And the hegemony of the political North over the political South keeps these simple solutions from getting the attention and support they need. When I traveled through India with the India Youth Climate Network in 2009, I witnessed solar hot water and photovoltaics and biogas everywhere and was told there were millions and millions of users. In 2011 and 2012, I was on 2 National Geographic expeditions to the highlands of Nepal, the Hinku and Khumbu trails leading from Lukla to Mount Everest, and the last mile villages in the most remote valleys where my job was to document and get GPS coordinates for all the renewable energy installations used by the Rai and Sherpa peoples. It turned out that the Nepalese government for years had been giving subsidies and support for people all over the country, no matter how remote, to put in solar electric panels and hot water systems and solar cookers and micro-hydro power plants and wind turbines and biodigesters. In fact, I was able to visit the BSP, or Biogas Support Program office in Kathmandu, to learn all about all the projects around the country, and then visit the Clean Cook Stove Alliance office in another part of the city, and then visited Tribhuvan University and Kathmandu University to see their climate solutions. At both universities, I met with students working on improved gasification systems, new designs for locally crafted windmills, and of course my favorite, biogas plants, and experiments in home-scale gas compression so residents can bottle the biogas they make at home for transport. In fact, out at Kathmandu University, they had a massive but modular biodigestion system built of interconnected 10 cubic meter Pusheen concrete systems like the ones we have at Rosebud, built piece by piece over time and added to, instead of having to invest in a single massive plant, which would be too expensive. And it had just been connected to a large biogas scrubbing and compression system funded by the Japanese government that created market-ready renewable natural gas made from the university's wastes. USF does not have that. No matter where I went, people not only knew about renewable energy, but were benefiting from it. And we National Geographic explorers joked that when the world ran out of oil, or there was some economic collapse, the safest place to be to lead a comfortable life would be the remote valleys of Nepal. We even stayed in a Sherpa home near Mount Everest that derived heat from their composting toilet and encouraged people to visit to help heat the house by making their contributions. You did know that aerobic composting is an exothermic process that releases heat, didn't you? And that if you mix animal manure, including human manure, with leaves and wood shavings and grass, you not only create fertile soil, but can get temperatures up to 140 Fahrenheit, right? You knew that, didn't you? If you didn't, you aren't alone among Northerners. Most of these things are known by people in the political South, the solar South, the ecological South, even if most can't afford them and most don't have government support programs like Nepal. But the stories that are being told, the myths being promulgated for political reasons, predominantly come from the political North. And there, in the lands of historically cold, dark winters and bleak, tall buildings and slum projects, there wasn't much emphasis or attention paid to simple solutions to complex problems. Well, when I was a kid in New York in the 1970s, we had a garbage strike that got so bad that the city was thinking of calling in the National Guard to deal with the piles of smelly garbage that were choking the streets and attracting rats. And the rats and the risk of typhoid and other diseases made the nightly news every day and threatened the city with disaster. At the same time, because of a spike in oil prices and a shortage of heating oil, many residents of those bleak, tall buildings literally froze to death in the winter. This disappointing moment in our nation's history sets the backdrop for the recent film The Joker, which captures the class struggles that our unimaginative approach to energy and waste created. The irony is that none of these problems were unsolvable then, and none are unsolvable now without the National Guard. And all could have been solved by a Solar Cities approach, using biodigesters to take care of literally all the organic garbage and ending the rat and smell problem forever, to say nothing of landfill greenhouse gas emissions, which simply don't occur when food waste is eliminated from the waste stream. And by using compost heat and solar heat, passive and active, to keep buildings warm, there would have been no death from cold. None of these are new technologies or ideas. None of them don't work in the North. It's just they require better insulation and design for heat capture and retention. The techniques have been known for centuries. Hell, even the Eskimos knew how to use insulation and body heat to keep igloos warm. But power politics, callous indifference to the comfort and safety of the working classes, the raw pursuit of profit at a steep environmental and social cost, and let's face it, real estate developers being cheap and poorly educated and cutting corners has caused misery for millions. With negative externalities encouraged by irresponsible policies, i.e. make the public pay for pollution and health effects, and perverse subsidies encouraging the use of artificially cheap fossil fuels for everything, there was no incentive to insulate buildings and houses, even though the EPA and government housing agencies had all proved that the simple act of insulation was the single most cost-effective and physically effective way to reduce fossil fuel use and save money. Second was the use of passive solar. The proper use of windows and skylights and deciduous trees alone to promote passive solar heating and cooling could save millions. I'll never forget moving from New York to sunny Los Angeles and calling a company that specialized in passive solar design. This is before the days of easy internet, when we still used phones with cords. An old man picked up the phone and I introduced myself as a new teacher of environmental science in the inner city schools who had just come to California, and I wanted to know how I could build a passive solar house. The old man said with a note of despair, You don't even want to try. My business is going bust. No demand, so many bureaucratic hurdles and regulations. The government's killing me. They don't want passive solar. It makes so much sense, but it must be an awful threat to them because nobody in this space can survive. Just give up now before you get hurt. That was sobering. But it wasn't the only call like that. A couple of years later, I was trying to build an alcohol-fueled car with my vocational students at Jefferson High School. I called the number written in the back of a great book called Solar Gas, How to Make Your Own Auto and Heating Fuel for Pennies a Gallon, a paperback from August 1st, 1982 by David Hoy. I picked the book up at the Harvard Used Bookstore when I was an undergraduate and kept it with me, and we started using it to build a solar alcohol still in our shop classes to fuel a truck I'd bought for conversion from the auto mechanics teacher. The man who answered the phone was very suspicious. He said, How did you get this number? I said, It was in your book. He said, Nobody reads that book. I said, Well, I've had it since college 10 years ago. I'm a teacher now, and we're trying to build one of your stills in shop class in the inner city. He said, How do I know that you aren't lying? I said, Well, you can call the school and verify, and the school secretary can hand me the phone. There were no cell phones then. He said, Listen, I'm not going to talk to you, but I sympathize with you, so I'm going to ask a friend who worked with me on the book to call you, and maybe he will answer your questions. And he hung up. A few minutes later, the school secretary called me over and said, Phone call for you, Mr. Culhane. When I picked up the phone, the new man on the phone was equally curt. He said, Listen, we published that book years ago during the oil embargo, thinking we could help people. But we're out of that business now. But it works, right? I persisted. He said, Of course it works. But if I were you, I would just drop it. It isn't worth it. But we can make our own alcohol fuel and run our truck on it, can't we? Listen, he said, I sympathize with you and I think you're doing a good thing, but I wouldn't try to take it very far, okay? Did someone threaten you, I asked. You said that. I'm saying nothing. Good luck to you and be careful. That's all I'm saying. And with that cryptic message, he hung up. A couple of years after that, I heard the same story at an environmental technology expo that I brought my students to showcase our projects in a booth paid for by our sponsor, Motion Picture Marine, who was helping us make educational videos about saving marine habitats. My students came running to our booth breathlessly, exclaiming, Mr. Culhane, there's a guy on the inventor's floor showing these really cool solar air conditioning systems and solar heating parabolic dishes. You have to meet him. He says you can heat and cool a house here in LA using nothing but the sun. We ran over to meet him, and the man, a kindly old engineer, said, Oh, you have to be our future. I've been trying to get my ideas and inventions out there for decades. He gestured to the large parabolic dish and Stirling engine and to a smaller setup of solar vacuum tubes filled with alcohol. As you can see, he said, my inventions work, and they run on sunlight, and they don't use any toxic or ozone-depleting chemicals. But for decades, I've not only been unable to make a living at this work, but I've had my life threatened several times. They even destroyed my equipment. So I'm giving up. But I stubbornly keep coming to things like this to show what I've created, hoping that young people like you can carry the torch forward. And so I have tried. The irony is that none of these things are hard to make. But in the North, most people don't seem to know or care about them. And in the solar South, where they really work well all year, some people may have heard of them and some may actually be using them, but it somehow never gets included in the major development plans, which of course are run by the North. We've tried, for example, to get biodigesters built in refugee camps to completely eliminate the threat of dreaded diseases like cholera and typhoid and dysentery and plague and rats and roaches and smells. And after a few hopeful trials, watched this initiative die on the vine, considered somehow impractical or not urgent. Mostly this is because, we are told, refugee camps, even the ones that have been around for decades, are not supposed to be considered permanent. And therefore, there's no incentive to build lasting infrastructure. Even the military has contracts for fossil fuels to be brought into their remote desert bases and for garbage and sewage to be trucked out, even though they could create a whole circular economy right there. There's a whole economic ecosystem with companies having made deals that Nexus Technologies would threaten. And so it is that the political North dominates the discourse and the ground reality in the solar South, and has made it almost impossible for the solar cities that we dream of to flourish. You want solar power? We own the, solar power isn't feasible.